There are very few relics of the mental hygiene movement left in Massachusetts, and the Metropolitan State Hospital is one of them. The institutional model was brought to the United States by Samuel Grinley Howe in the 1800s. The idea was to segregate those with mental disabilities, isolate them, and keep them out of the gene pool. This introduction came from the need to address the question that's plagued the nation since its inception. What do we do with people who are other than us? By the 1890s, every state in the U.S. had a state hospital built. These institutions were a place to put these people, as they brought shame to both their families and their communities. It was a shame that was, of course, an after effect of the othering of another population. Despite how many hospitals were across the country, overcrowding was quick to set in during the early 20th century, as governments were quick to realize that these institutions could be stuffed with anyone out of the ordinary should it be explained away by a psychiatric cause. Now, in modern day, the mental institutions and their treatment of patients as they were has gone out of fashion some 40-odd years ago, marked as inhumane and cruel to an indescribable level. Even when those practices were introduced, they were argued against time and time again by the very people that helped create them. So, why in the world did our government allow those practices to happen? To fully understand the legality of all that occurred, you need to understand what actually happened. There were 6 main types of treatment popular during the mental hygiene and community health eras: isolation, insulin coma therapy, electroshock therapy, hydrotherapy, letrozole therapy, and then the infamous lobotomy. Isolation was popular when asylums first began to pop up across the country, as asylums provided places where people with mental disorders could be placed to remove them from the view of their families and communities. The treatment was the embodiment of the sentiment that surrounded institutions as a whole: out of sight, out of mind. However, the isolation did little good for the patients themselves. Patients were kept to the campus of the institution and away from both their families and wider society. Patients with developmental disorders like Down syndrome, cri de chat, autism, they often relied on their families for love and support, as institutions had a very hands-off way of handling them. So when that's taken away from them and they're isolated with people with similar disorders who are equally dysfunctional as they suffer for it.
My mommy's gone, my daddy's gone. I will never see my sisters again, or my brother, or anybody again. I'm here for life.
Unlike electroshock and hydrotherapy, insulin coma therapy wasn't massively popular for all too long. It was introduced in 1927 and then fell out of favor in the early 1930s with the introduction of ECT. This therapy came from the belief that the fluctuation in insulin levels alters how the brain functions, which, of course, was correct. Insulin signaling in the brain is involved in neuropathological processes like cognitive decline. Insulin coma therapy forces the patients into hypoglycemia, which is low glucose in the blood. The hypoglycemia made patients restless and liable for convulsions of the body. The aftershocks of the therapy required constant supervision due to the risk carried by convulsions. The practice stayed until about the 1950s, when it was discredited, a side effect of it being one of the only specific treatments for schizophrenia. But it began to fall out of favor when electroshock therapy came onto the scene in the 1930s. ECT is actually still in practice today, but in a very, very different way. ECT is when the patient has high doses of electricity given to the brain, and unlike in modern times, it was done without the use of any anesthetic or numbing, which of course led to pain, fear, anxiety, and in some cases even fractured or broken bones. Direct shocks to the brain, especially high voltage ones, alter the brain chemistry. This altering was done in hopes of making the patient more docile and cooperative. A similar practice was hydrotherapy, which is another treatment still used today. Although it's not the harshest treatment seen in institutions, depending on where the patient actually was, the experience would be vastly different. Then, of course, there were medication treatments like letrozole therapy. Letrozole is a very strong CNS stimulant, or a part of a drug group that can heighten wakefulness and alertness while diminishing fatigue. The detriment to this, however, is when a CNS stimulant is given in high doses, which is done in letrozole therapy. It can cause feelings of agitation, paranoia, panic, and produce hallucinations. Some well-known CNS stimulants are actually cocaine and amphetamines. In actual metrazole therapy, the patient would be induced with seizures by an injection of this stimulant. This would result in fractures, torn muscles, bruising, and in some cases, breaks due to the thrashing that usually occurs with seizures. This treatment was usually administered several times a week, in comparison to the usual twice-a-week ECT patients underwent. The majority of these treatments are all something that could occur at least on a weekly basis, with only one outlier: the lobotomy. A lobotomy is the separation of the frontal lobe from the rest of the brain. Walter Jackson Freeman wasn't actually the first person in history to come up with removing parts of the head to solve problems, as trephination, the creation of a hole in the skull, is one of the oldest known procedures in human history. The frontal lobe is the frontmost part of the brain, and it has control over many important things: reasoning, social understanding, executive functions, voluntary muscle movements, learning, memory, self-control, inhibitions, and many, many more. The frontal lobe is where the personality is, and it is the main dictator in our actions. When the frontal lobe is damaged, the person could lose parts of their personality, their ability to walk, talk. It's a loss of autonomy. There are actually three types. There is the topectomy, which is the cutting form of a lobotomy. The patient's skull would be cut open, and then parts of the frontal lobe would be removed. There is also the neuroinjection of sclerosing agents, which injects drugs to harden the fibers connecting the frontal lobe and the thalamus. And then there's the most well-known type, the leucotomy, wherein the connection between the frontal lobe and the thalamus is completely severed. The leucotomy is the procedure that was utilized by Freeman's transorbital lobotomy. The transorbital lobotomy was first performed on September 14, 1936 by Walter Freeman and James Watts on Sally Ellen Inesco, a 29-year-old housewife who was described as depressed and suicidal. Freeman continued his practice, traveling to 23 states in a van and performing a transorbital lobotomy on at least 2,500 people before he was banned from operating in 1967, after the death of Helen Mortensen during her third lobotomy with him. So why did the government allow this to happen? Even without the actual medical treatments given to patients in mental institutions were treated horribly. Female patients were sexually assaulted by staff and patients alike. Their education was neglected and never actually nurtured. The food was subpar. The patients had little say in anything they did. Almost every bit of these institutions were in violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights established by the UN in 1948, prior to the height of these institutions in the Western world. So, how could the government that's supposed to protect us let this happen with their own funding? Laws only exist when the need of prevention becomes clear. Protections of child actors weren't considered until Jackie Cogan came onto the scene in 1920. Genocide prevention wasn't considered until the occurrence of the Holocaust and Samud Darapin in the 1940s. And disability rights weren't really thought of until the deinstitutionalization movement began. It wasn't until after all the horrors had begun to close that any legal action was fully taken to prevent it from happening again. The idea surrounding the competency of those with mental illness, or as it was classified under the wide umbrella of mental retardation, was that state parties were to presume incompetence and incapacity, leaving either the state or their families to make decisions
of their treatment for them. We had no choice because her hyperactivity was taking effect on Christopher, who was 3 years younger, and so we had to make a decision, and the only thing available was Penhurst.
Now, ignoring the law entirely, there's also the social aspect to consider. The first half of the 1900s saw the rise of the eugenics movement in the United States, wherein feeble-mindedness was thought to be destroyed and cast out from society. A common practice in institutions was, of course, to sterilize the patients to prevent them from reproducing. But this was also done all across the US as well, and it was perfectly legal. Forced sterilization was declared constitutional by the Supreme Court, and that decision still stands today. Eugenics targeted anyone who differed from the norms of society: sexual deviants, paupers, psychotics, alcoholics, imbeciles, and morons. Anything that could be properly condemned. And people who were diagnosed with mental retardation fell into that category, which made it acceptable to try and fix them any way possible. Ouch. I know, just thorns.